When Lorraine signed those divorce papers with trembling hands, she had no idea her ex-husband had been planning this for months. He took their daughter, he took the business she built, he took everything. But what he didn't know was that Lorraine had been documenting everything, and his perfect new life was about to crumble. Lorraine Bennett was 32 years old when she met Derek Mitchell, and she was exhausted. She'd been working two jobs for 3 years straight, a full-time accounting position at a mid-sized firm during the day and weekend catering gigs that often ran past midnight. Her tiny apartment in the city was nothing special, but it was hers, paid for with money she'd earned through sheer determination and countless sleepless nights. She had dreams bigger than spreadsheets and serving trays, though. She wanted to build something of her own, something that mattered. Derek walked into her life at a networking event she'd almost skipped. He was charming in an unpolished way, with big ideas about technology solutions for small businesses, and an infectious enthusiasm that made people lean in when he spoke. But Lorraine noticed something others didn't. Derek had vision but no foundation. He had concepts but no execution plan. He had ambition but no understanding of how businesses actually worked, how money moved, how deals closed. When he pitched his startup idea to a small group that night, Lorraine saw exactly what was missing. And for some reason she'd later question 1,000 times, she approached him after and offered to help. Their courtship was a whirlwind mixture of romance and business planning. Late nights in her apartment turned into early mornings, coffee cups scattered across her kitchen table alongside business plans that Lorraine drafted, while Derek paced and dreamed out loud. She found herself falling for him, for his passion, his belief that they could build something revolutionary together. He told her she was brilliant, that she was the piece he'd been missing, that together they were unstoppable. Within 6 months, they'd launched Mitchell Tech Solutions with Lorraine's entire savings, $28,000 she'd scraped together over years. Derek insisted the company carry his name because, as he explained, investors responded better to established-sounding surnames. Lorraine didn't argue. She was in love, and besides, she reasoned, ownership mattered more than names. They married in a simple courthouse ceremony, and 3 months later, Lorraine discovered she was pregnant. Their daughter Nia arrived the following spring, a beautiful baby with Lorraine's eyes and Derek's smile. For the next 5 years, Lorraine poured everything she had into 2 full-time jobs she never got credit for, raising their daughter and building their company. She managed every financial aspect of the business, created the entire operational framework, handled client relations, and somehow still found time to be the mother Nia deserved. Meanwhile, Derek traveled to conferences, networked with investors, and gradually became the public face of Mitchell Tech Solutions. The company grew faster than either of them had imagined. Lorraine's accounting background and strategic thinking turned Derek's vague concepts into profitable realities. She secured their first major client through her network, then their second and third. She built relationships with vendors, negotiated contracts that saved them thousands, and created financial projections that attracted serious investors. But in meetings, Derek presented everything as our vision, while introducing Lorraine as my wife, or sometimes my better half, as if her role was purely supportive rather than foundational. The shift happened so gradually that Lorraine didn't recognize it until it was too late. Derek started dismissing her suggestions in front of employees, calling her overly cautious when she raised concerns about risky expenditures. He'd pat her hand during investor meetings and say things like, "Lorraine worries, but that's what makes her such a great mother." The words sounded affectionate, but they diminished her, reduced her from business partner to anxious spouse. His family, wealthy people from old money who'd initially been horrified that Derek had married a black woman, began making comments that cut deeper each time. "At least Nia got Derek's complexion," his mother said once, as if Lorraine's darker skin was something their granddaughter had fortunately avoided. Everything changed when Mitchell Tech Solutions landed a $3 million contract with a national retail chain. Suddenly, Derek was being featured in business magazines, invited to speak on panels, courted by venture capitalists. One of those VCs was Stephanie Crawford, a 30-year-old white woman with an MBA from Harvard and family connections that opened doors Derek had only dreamed about. Lorraine noticed how Stephanie looked at Derek, how she laughed at everything he said, how her hand lingered on his arm during conversations. She noticed how Derek started staying late at the office more often, how he began criticizing Lorraine's appearance, suggesting she dress more professionally even though she worked from home, commenting that she'd let herself go after having Nia. The confrontation came on a Tuesday evening. Lorraine had found a credit card statement showing charges at expensive restaurants and hotels on nights Derek claimed to be working late. When she asked him about it, he didn't even bother denying the affair. "I've outgrown you, Lorraine," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "You were useful when I had nothing, but I need someone who fits my life now. Stephanie understands the business world. She can stand beside me at events without embarrassing me." The words hit Lorraine like physical blows. Embarrassing him? She'd built this business. She'd sacrificed everything for him, for their family, for the dream they were supposed to be building together. 2 weeks later, Derek filed for divorce. His lawyers were ruthless and expensive, and they came armed with a strategy designed to destroy her. During custody hearings, they painted Lorraine as unstable, overly emotional, an unfit mother who prioritized work over her daughter. They used her demanding schedule against her, the same schedule she'd maintained to build Derek's company, as evidence of neglect. They produced edited text messages that made her seem aggressive and unreasonable. They brought in witnesses, employees who depended on Derek for their livelihoods, who testified that Lorraine was barely involved in the business and had anger management issues. None of it was true, but Derek's legal team was convincing, and they had resources Lorraine couldn't match. The judge's ruling felt like a death sentence. Derek was granted primary custody of Nia. Lorraine would be allowed supervised visits only, every other weekend, 2 hours at a time, with a court-appointed monitor present. The business was deemed Derek's intellectual property since his name was on all the founding documents, never mind that Lorraine's money and work had built it. She received a settlement of $45,000, barely enough to cover her legal fees and 2 months' rent. Derek walked out of that courtroom with everything, their daughter, their business, their life together, while Lorraine walked out with nothing but a small check and a supervised visitation schedule. The months that followed were the darkest of Lorraine's life. She moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood she didn't recognize, walls so thin she could hear her neighbors' conversations. She could barely function, going through each day in a fog of grief and disbelief. Meanwhile, Derek paraded his new life across social media like a trophy collection. Photos of him and Stephanie at charity galas, Nia dressed in designer clothes she'd never worn with Lorraine, family vacations to places Lorraine had once dreamed of visiting. He sent messages that were designed to twist the knife deeper. "Nia asked why you don't live in a nice house like us," one text read. "She's adjusting well to her new normal," said another, as if Lorraine was the disruption rather than the mother who'd been stolen from her child. The supervised visits were torture. Nia seemed confused and distant, her natural warmth replaced with a cautious politeness that broke Lorraine's heart. During their 6th visit, Nia said something that changed everything. "Daddy says you didn't really help build the company," the little girl said, her voice uncertain. "He says you just stayed home and took care of me. Miss Stephanie says you were never really a business person." Lorraine felt something crack inside her chest. Derek wasn't just taking Nia's present. He was erasing Lorraine from their shared past, rewriting history so their daughter would grow up believing her mother had contributed nothing, had been nothing. That night, alone in her apartment with the muffled sounds of other people's lives bleeding through the walls, Lorraine hit bottom. She stared at the custody agreement papers, at the tiny settlement check, at her phone filled with images of Derek's perfect new life, and she wanted to disappear. What was the point of fighting? Derek had money, connections, lawyers who could make black seem white and truth seem like lies. He'd already won. But then her best friend Denise showed up at her door, let herself in with the spare key Lorraine had given her, and staged an intervention that probably saved Lorraine's life. "You listen to me," Denise said, her voice fierce with love and frustration. "You are not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for Nia. That little girl needs to see what a strong black woman does when the world tries to break her. She needs to see that you don't just lie down and let people erase you. Get up, Lorraine. Get up and fight back." Something shifted in Lorraine that night. The grief was still there, but underneath it, a spark of the woman she used to be flickered back to life. She started thinking strategically, the way she used to think when solving complex business problems. She couldn't beat Derek with money or connections, but she had something else. She had the truth, and she had been meticulous about documentation from the very beginning. Lorraine still had access to cloud backups of company files from the early years, before Derek had locked her out of everything. She spent weeks going through thousands of documents, emails, financial records, meeting notes. What she found was more explosive than she'd imagined. Derek hadn't just minimized her contributions, he'd been committing actual fraud. She discovered shell companies he'd created to hide income from the IRS, falsified financial statements provided to investors, and most damning of all, documents where he'd forged her signature on loan applications and investment agreements. He'd committed identity theft, tax fraud, and securities fraud, all while building his empire on her foundation. But the evidence that made Lorraine's hands shake with rage was what she found about the custody case. Emails between Derek and his lawyers discussing how to manage witness testimony, bank transfers to one of the court-appointed evaluators who'd recommended against joint custody, text messages proving Derek had been planning to push her out of the business and file for divorce at least 14 months before he actually did, while still sharing her bed, still letting her work 60-hour weeks for their company, still pretending they were building a future together. Lorraine knew she needed help, the right kind of help. She reached out to Malcolm Rodriguez, an investigative journalist who'd made his name exposing corporate corruption and white-collar crime. She also contacted a boutique law firm that specialized in business fraud cases. The lawyers, two women who'd built their practice on David versus Goliath cases, reviewed her evidence and agreed to represent her pro bono. They saw what Lorraine saw, a black woman systematically erased from her own story by a man who'd used her brilliance to build his success, then discarded her when she was no longer useful. The timing, Lorraine learned, was critical. Mitchell Tech Solutions was about to go public with a $50 million IPO. Derek was on the verge of becoming genuinely wealthy, and he'd built all his projections on the reputation of a company that Lorraine had actually created. Her lawyers advised her to wait, to let Derek get close enough to his dream that the fall would be catastrophic. Malcolm's article dropped 1 week before the scheduled IPO. The headline read, "The Woman Erased: How Derek Mitchell Built an Empire on His Wife's Labor and Lies." The investigation was thorough, devastating, and backed by irrefutable evidence. Malcolm had done more than report Lorraine's story. He'd independently verified every claim, tracked down the shell companies, interviewed witnesses who were willing to tell the truth away from Derek's influence, and built a timeline that showed exactly how Derek had systematically stolen credit for Lorraine's work while committing multiple felonies. The response was immediate and explosive. The article went viral, shared hundreds of thousands of times across social media. News outlets picked it up. People were outraged, not just about what Derek had done to Lorraine, but about the systematic way powerful men erased women's contributions, especially black women's contributions, from business success stories. Investors panicked and began pulling out of the IPO. Federal investigators opened criminal probes into Derek's business practices, and Stephanie Crawford, ever strategic, issued a public statement distancing herself from Derek and his alleged activities. The emergency custody hearing felt like stepping into an alternate universe. This time, Lorraine had lawyers who fought for her, who presented her meticulously documented evidence, who showed the judge exactly how Derek had manipulated the previous proceedings. They demonstrated the fraud, the forgery, the bribery. They showed emails where Derek had explicitly discussed keeping Lorraine in line by threatening her custody rights. They brought in real witnesses, former employees who'd left the company, people who didn't depend on Derek for their livelihoods, who testified about Lorraine's integral role in building Mitchell Tech Solutions. Derek's expensive lawyers had no counter. Every lie they'd carefully constructed unraveled in real time. The judge, a different one this time, was visibly angry about how his colleague had been deceived. The ruling came swiftly. Lorraine was granted primary custody of Nia, effective immediately. Derek would have supervised visits only, the same humiliating arrangement he'd forced on Lorraine. But the ruling went further. Based on the financial evidence and witness testimony, the court recognized Lorraine as the true co-founder of Mitchell Tech Solutions and awarded her 60% ownership of the company. The judge's words were scathing. Mr. Mitchell built his success on his wife's stolen labor, stolen money, and stolen identity. This court will not allow such theft to stand. Derek was also facing criminal charges: fraud, perjury, identity theft, and bribery. His reputation was destroyed. His engagement to Stephanie was over. The IPO was canceled. Everything he'd built on Lorraine's foundation crumbled into dust. 6 months later, Lorraine stood in the restructured headquarters of what was now called Bennett Mitchell Solutions. She'd taken over as CEO, and under her leadership, the company had not only survived the scandal, but thrived. She'd made it more ethical, more diverse, more focused on sustainable growth rather than flashy expansion. The company was worth more than it had ever been under Derek's leadership, and every employee knew exactly who'd built it. Derek, meanwhile, was living in a small apartment, awaiting trial, his legal fees consuming what little money he had left. The reversal was complete. Everything he'd taken from Lorraine had been returned, and everything he'd built on lies had collapsed. Lorraine took no particular pleasure in his suffering, but she wouldn't pretend it wasn't just. The afternoon she picked Nia up from school for the first time without supervision was one of the sweetest moments of her life. Nia ran to her with the natural joy of a child who finally understood she could love her mother without fear or confusion. In the car, Nia held up a magazine. "Mommy, my teacher showed us this. You're in it. It says you're one of the most powerful women in business." Lorraine looked at the cover, at the photo of herself in the office she'd earned, and smiled. "I want you to remember something, baby," she said softly. "People will try to take credit for your work. They'll try to erase you. They'll try to make you small. But the truth always comes to light. Always. And you are never as powerless as they want you to believe." 3 months after that, Lorraine stood on a stage at a conference for women entrepreneurs, particularly women of color who faced the same obstacles she'd overcome. She shared her story without bitterness, only strength. "They thought I would disappear quietly," she told the audience. "They thought because I was a black woman, no one would believe me, no one would care. They thought they could erase me from my own story and nobody would notice. But I had something more powerful than their lies. I had the truth and I had the receipts. I documented everything, every contribution, every dollar, every idea. And when they tried to bury me, they forgot something important." She paused, looking out at hundreds of faces watching her with rapt attention. When you try to bury a strong woman, you're not burying her, you're planting her, and she will grow. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. In the audience, Nia sat beside Denise, watching her mother with pride and understanding. This was the lesson Lorraine wanted her daughter to carry forward, not the story of what had been done to them, but the story of what they'd done in response, the story of a woman who refused to be erased. Derek Mitchell lost everything: his company, his reputation, his daughter's respect, and his freedom. Lorraine Bennett gained everything back and more. She didn't just survive, she reclaimed her legacy. Because when you try to bury a strong woman, you forget. She's not buried, she's planted, and she will grow.